going to introduce our next speaker. This is Dr. Natasha Ludwig from the Kennedy Krieger Institute, and she's going to be talking a bit about this Inchstones project, which I might have alluded to earlier, which is really helping us sort of move the needle on finding non-seizure clinical endpoints.
Hey everyone, I'm so happy to be here today. So I'm definitely going to talk about the Inchstone project a bit during my talk, but I'm also going to talk about patient-focused outcome measurement in rare neurogenetic conditions, measuring what matters. So I am a clinician. I'm a neuropsychologist at Kennedy Krieger in Baltimore, Maryland, and I'm also a researcher. And so I see many patients with rare neurogenetic causes of epilepsy, including channelopathies like KCNQ2. So thank you so much for having me today. So here's a bit about my funding. I don't have any disclosures, but really the goal of my talk today is really to emphasize the importance of your voice as patients and caregivers in the development of meaningful outcome measures needed for clinical care and clinical trials. Sharing your voice is possible through participating in research, and I'm going to illustrate some of that today. So let's first talk about why we need measures, right? So we need measures for clinical care, right? To understand the individual. I administer a lot of measures as a neuropsychologist to diagnose and to categorize like severity level of certain aspects of a condition, to monitor. So as a neuropsychologist, I'm very interested in neurodevelopment, so tracking that over time for kids. And I see adults as well. Also research studies to understand the group, right? So natural history studies collect health information to understand how a disease develops and progresses over time. And clinical trials, right? We need measures. Individuals are assigned to one or more treatments to evaluate the effect of those treatments on outcomes. And we use outcome measures to measure these effects, right? So measures are important, but what should we measure? So I think that we should be sure to measure things that are really what matter most to patients, as these are the aspects of the condition that treatments should target. So, we should be targeting things in terms of our measure development, in terms of our drug development and other therapeutic interventions that really target the things that matter most, right? So let's focus on clinical trial readiness for a moment. There are currently no treatments specifically approved for the FDA for KCNQ2 by the FDA for KCNQ2, but therapies are on the horizon, right? And we need to have good outcome measures ready for use in clinical trials. This is critical to test whether new treatments work, and if we don't have good measures that target concepts that are important to patients, treatments that work may not be approved. So this is really, really important. So how do we develop good measures? It's all about taking a patient-focused approach. That's my opinion, and that's what FDA thinks too. And so the FDA has put out patient-focused drug development guidances, and so these really illustrate a systematic approach to help ensure that patients' experiences, perspectives, needs, and priorities are captured and meaningfully incorporated in the drug development and evaluation process. And that includes outcome measure development. And so they say as experts, they're experts in what it's like to live with their condition. Patients are uniquely positioned to inform the understanding of the therapeutic context for drug development and evaluation. And so this is really important because these guidances are meant for FDA themselves when they need to make regulatory approvals. They're important for industry. They're important for researchers like me and other stakeholders, including patient advocacy groups, to understand. And so this is a really nice figure from one of the FDA guidances. It's probably kind of small to read, but it's okay. We'll kind of go through it together. So this is a roadmap to patient-focused outcome measurement in clinical trials. Really, this is FDA's way of helping us understand how we include the patient voice in outcome measure development through that whole process. And I want to emphasize here that the FDA thinks that both quantitative and qualitative methods are both really important. And I want to emphasize this for a moment because quantitative methods are how most researchers are traditionally trained. We think in numbers, right? We give surveys, we measure things in a quantitative manner, but qualitative research is also really important to understand the patient experience and inform measure development. So Qualitative approaches, they may not, so the thing with quantitative, we can reach a lot of people very quickly with surveys and things like that, but qualitative approaches may be able, they're typically given on a smaller number of people, but it gives us an opportunity to get more like in-depth information, right? So this is like interviews and focus groups. So certainly what Michelle just talked about, those qualitative interviews, you got really in-depth information. But of course, in a smaller number than you might be able to reach with like a really broad survey. But again, both of those methods are really important and are emphasized by the FDA as being important. And so I think, as researchers, we need to like partner more with our qualitative, methodologists in doing this work. And I think this is emphasized, one of my research teams, the Inchstone project, which I'll talk more about in a moment, we had a meeting with FDA early this year, and one of the main points that they said is like, listen, you must have good qualitative data. Good quantitative work will not solve the problems of poor qualitative work. So this is truly important that we set up research studies that really are aimed at gathering in-depth information from conversations with you. Okay, so the first two elements of that roadmap from FDA in terms of patient-focused outcome measure development really focus on understanding the condition and concepts of interest. So concepts of interest is really a fancy term for outcomes of importance to patients and families. And so there's a lot of ways that we gather this information. But I will focus in here on what the concept of interest, it's really an aspect of an individual's experience or clinical, biological, physical, or functional state that an outcome measure is intended to capture. And really the FDA says that for clinical trials, we should select those concepts or outcomes that reflect an aspect of health that's really important to patients. So now I'm going to walk through just some examples of quantitative and qualitative patient-powered ways to capture patient experience data to inform understanding of the condition and identifying concepts of interest for measure development. So this is something, a project that was done through the Inchstone project. I'll tell you a little bit more about the details of Inchstone later, but I want to highlight a few pieces of data gathered through that work group. So we did a study looking at, we did a survey really targeting caregivers of individuals with DEE, so developmental and epileptic encephalopathies, really who are more severely affected from a functional standpoint. And so we had 267 individuals with DEEs plus severe impairments complete this survey, and we asked them, to rate different areas of significant impact to quality of life. And what's really interesting at the bottom here, you can see the top impacts are communication, cognition, gross motor function. These are highly overlapping, right, with the survey that Michelle just talked about for your group in particular. So I think some of these concepts are really applicable across other DEEs as well. Which I think is really interesting and something we really need to pay attention to when we're thinking about doing broader studies that are maybe more inclusive of broader DEEs into kind of one study and increasing the power that we have to make inferences, because with more individuals included, we can increase our statistical power. And in that same survey, we also asked caregivers to fill out a questionnaire about quality of life. And then we looked at a bunch of different medical factors and patient functional and neurodevelopmental factors that may be predictive of quality of life. And what was really interesting in our study is we found that cognition was the biggest predictor of high and low quality of life. Remember, this is a sample of many different etiologies of developmental epilepsy, right? But definitely targeting the more severe end. And what's interesting is when you look at the cognition score, it's based off of a parent-reported measure of cognition called the Developmental Profile 4, but the cutoff was a raw score of 4. And so that's pretty low. And when I looked at what are those concepts that are being measured around a raw score of 4, it's really foundational aspects of cognition like alertness, awareness, and responsivity to the environment, okay? And what's really interesting is on the right here, you can see on the x-axis, from 0 to 10 raw score points, we're really seeing a steep increase in quality of life when we see really small changes to those kind of foundational aspects of cognition. I think this is really interesting because it means that small changes can be really meaningful for these for these patients. And so again, this is something that's helping us understand these concepts that are really important. I don't think we really would have paid, I mean, we had some idea around this idea of these foundational aspects of cognition being important, but this was just kind of a way that really kind of made us recognize that we need to be focusing on this as a concept of interest for this group. Another way that we asked about what's important is to just simply ask caregivers, what does a good day look like for your child? What does a bad day look like for your child? And again, we got some of those elements of, alertness, awareness, but we also got a lot around emotional regulation, and seizures came up when we asked about, how do you know your child's having a bad day? So seizures, screaming, sleeping, crying. And so I think this is a simple way to kind of, again, gather more information about that patient experience and things that matter most, right? So these three kind of projects I just described have really helped shape our Inchstone project's concepts of interest that we're really focusing on when we're talking about developing clinical outcome measures. And then quickly, I'll talk about some work I do with a different patient group called ASXL. It's another rare neurogenetic condition associated with intellectual disability, profound autism, seizures. And so we did a really very short survey that we administered, we had open for 2 weeks, and we had 200 families respond, because all they needed to do was just say, what are the top 3 symptoms you think are of priority to treat? And so it was very easy for families to do that. And so what rose to the top was neurodevelopment, behavior challenges, and GI symptoms. And while we didn't get a lot of in-depth information about these concepts, we got a lot of information very quickly. And this led us to apply for a grant through PCORI to allow us to engage more families through focus groups at our conference last year. And so we had the support and funding to run 15 focus groups, really focused on better understanding the lived experience around those 3 priority areas: neurodevelopment, gastrointestinal symptoms, and behavior. And we had caregivers really describe what the impacts are, what daily life is like, what are the research questions that you have in those areas, to help us, again, with this effort of developing better outcome measures for this group. And so the big question, what are the concepts of interest for KCNQ2? I think, Michelle really touched on some of those that are important. Something she mentioned as well is that relevant constructs may differ based on patient factors like age or ability level. And so she was saying, the motor pieces might be more relevant to those more on the severe functional range. And I think this issue is really relevant across many rare neurogenetic conditions, and DEEs included. And so we need to think about, as a field, are there concepts that may span the populations that are very heterogeneous? Because that's going to give us the biggest bang for our buck, right? Because if we can find those constructs that are most applicable, most broadly, we can develop measures that are going to be most broadly applicable and inclusive, right, of our patient groups. So I think, I shared about why we need to measure concepts that are important to patients. I think neurodevelopment definitely rises to the top across a lot of conditions. But the outcome measures that we have for neurodevelopment, we need to be thinking, are they relevant to everybody? Are they valid? So meaning, are we measuring what we think we're measuring? Are they sensitive to meaningful differences across groups? And are they sensitive to meaningful changes over time for all patients that are impacted? And so as a neuropsychologist, I can tell you, our measures, particularly in neurodevelopment, are really limited. And I imagine some of you may have experienced this too for your own children, when you're getting a neurodevelopmental evaluation. I've had some families come and tell me, oh, I saw somebody and they said, my child can't be evaluated, and we need to do better as a field. We need to do better to have measures that, measure relevant skill sets, that accommodate for sensory motor impairments, that include compensatory strategies like AAC devices, right? And I think, a lot of times when I'm seeing somebody who is maybe 20 years old, but functioning, more in that 1 to 3 year kind of developmental level, I'm forced to use tools that are meant for really young children. And, the materials are like rubber duckies and like we're playing peekaboo. And it's like some kids who are 20 may like that, but some may not, right? And so we really need to be thinking about the appropriateness of some of our tools as well, because that speaks to validity. And we need to make sure our tools are granular enough to capture meaningful changes that families are seeing. A lot of times I see families and they say, my child's doing a lot better, but their scores are exactly the same. And so that's not good, right? We need to do better. And again, so we need better tools for clinical trial readiness, but also for informing care at the individual level. I'm just being honest with you guys, that's why I got into this whole space, because I was frustrated as a clinician when I was asked to tell a neurologist in a family, like, is this child doing better from a neurodevelopmental standpoint, before and after we put them on this new medicine. So there's a real need. So going back to FDA's roadmap to clinical outcome measure development and taking a patient focus, this is just a slide that describes, really what a clinical outcome assessment is. So in a clinical trial, clinical outcome measures, or COAs, describe or reflect how a person feels, functions, or survives. And they're patient reported, there's observer reported, so like caregiver questionnaires are an example of that, clinician reported, and then performance reported. And I think, one thing FDA recognizes, and just researchers in general, is that, these outcome measures need to be valid. I think I mentioned this earlier, but that just means that we need to make sure that they're actually measuring what we think they're measuring. And sometimes they don't when they're applied to new populations. And so this really just articulates some of the steps and things we need to consider. So a lot of times we go to the literature, hey, is there a measure that's patient-focused, that's appropriate for this population, that's valid? And if not, we need to start thinking about developing a new measure. And I think the only way that we can really select and develop measures is to partner with patients in that endeavor. And so here are just some examples of patient-powered efforts to validate patient-focused outcome measures. And one is, again, my work through the Inchstone project. So I touched on a few studies we've done so far, but I want to delve a little deeper into this. So the Inchstone project, their goal is really to collaborate with patients to develop patient-focused outcome measures that capture relevant aspects of functioning and that can capture meaningful changes in individuals with severe impairments associated with epilepsy, or genetic etiologies of epilepsy or severe intellectual disability. So we are a multi-interest holder team science group, and so what's really cool is this whole thing was started by patient advocates. So Gabi Conacher and Jada Hecker are patient advocates, and they really brought us all together, and we meet every single week together as a group and talk science. And so they're giving their input the whole time, and they're an amazing resource to go to. And we also have, a steering committee as well that we can go to get feedback, which includes clinician scientists, but also a whole bunch of patient advocates and advisors. And we have some industry involvement as well, who are supporting this effort. So they're at the table talking with us, which is always wonderful. And, this is an article I wanted to highlight. This really outlines the Inchstone project, and the first two authors are patient advocates themselves. So truly we are collaborators in research. And so some of the methods that we use are both quantitative and qualitative, but I wanted to mention a couple of things here. So we do a lot of content validity studies, and what that means is we give measures to caregivers and we ask them to actually, as they're filling them out, think out loud, right? Because that can help us understand, are they thinking about this in the same way that we think they're thinking about this, right? And can it check us and make sure, if we need to tweak things and modify things, that we actually get that directly from the caregivers. We ask them things like, are these questions easy to understand? If they're not, we're not going to get good data, right? Are these questions relevant to your child? That's really important, and one of the most important things about measurement, right? And then, was there anything missing from this questionnaire? So we need to be comprehensive in the way that we're assessing certain concepts of interest. So these questions help us ensure we're measuring what we think we're measuring in trials and for your child's clinical decision making. Again, we are focused on clinical trial readiness, but also making sure that these tools get into the clinic, right? And we can't do the work without you. And then the last concept I'll talk about here is meaningful change, right? And so we need measures to be sensitive enough to capture meaningful changes in the outcome of interest. But the challenge for many neurodevelopmental conditions like KCNQ2, they're unable to capture small changes that may be meaningful to patients, okay? And so we've started to do some qualitative work in this area. So on the left here is a study we did with SCN2A, which is another channelopathy, and we asked caregivers to describe, like, what might a meaningful change look like for your child in 4 different functional areas. I believe it was, feeding, communication, behavior regulation, and I'm forgetting the 4th one right now, but I can get that info for you. And we asked them, what would a meaningful change look like? And what we found is a couple of things. Even though everybody in our sample was more severe to profoundly impacted, we still were able to split, relatively, kids with relatively higher support needs and less support needs. And so for those caregivers of kids with the more support needs, they were saying, smaller changes would be meaningful. They would expect a smaller change and that would have a big impact. But for the the kids who needed relatively less support, the caregivers were expecting bigger changes to happen, and that would be meaningful. The other thing is we asked caregivers to describe what a meaningful change would look like in the context of a small molecule trial versus a gene therapy trial, where there are potentially more risks, right? And across the board, we found that caregivers would expect a bigger change as meaningful if they're in a trial that has more risks, right? And so we kind of call this concept worthwhile change. And so I think it's really important to be asking caregivers about that in terms of looking at how our measures are meaningful and in the context of trials. I think that was a really interesting study. And more recently, we came out with another study where we asked, this was part of that big caregiver survey with all of the individuals with DEEs with more severe impairment. We asked, for them they rated their top priorities for treatment. And then we asked them to say, okay, well, what would a meaningful change look like, and why would that be meaningful? And there was a lot of commonality in kind of those concepts of meaningful change. So capacity to communicate preferences and emotions. They wanted their child to gain sitting and walking skills, being able to grasp objects for play purposes, eating foods without choking, or using utensils. And then also the reasons why those changes would be meaningful. Commonly, things that caregivers mentioned was to impact health, independence and safety, care regimens, quality of life for the affected individual, but also for the family more broadly. Okay. So in conclusion, I just want to say, the moral of the story here is that your voice really matters and will your voice is going to move the field forward. We must bring together experts and patient caregivers early in this process of measure development, as this is going to maximize the likelihood of developing tools that are valid and will capture meaningful outcomes for clinical care and clinical trials. So look out for more studies from the Inchstone project and also, the foundation more broadly, and ways to get involved. And so thank you so much.